I encountered a few negative entities, evil spirits. One I encountered was latched to my now ex. Before we dated, she told me she had an entity attached to her that would make her stuffed animals contort, so she burned them, just out of pure terror. Eventually, when my ex and I began to date, it started revealing itself to me. It would tell me its name is Carden. Soon after that, it started telling me that it wanted to marry me, kill me, and live together after death, and that its only reason for tormenting my ex was because her pain pleasured it. Another time I had some entity appear when I was home alone, going to bed. I felt something was around and felt uneasy. I typically feel like my chest has an extremely heavy weight on it when an oppressive entity is around. And I started to hear something scraping on the hardwood floors, and something walking around outside my room. I kinda just ignored it, and eventually saw a gray creature with 3 fly-like eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, just smiling at me, sitting at the end of the bed. This particular entity was interesting. After that day, it then locked onto my ex, seeing as it couldn't affect me otherwise. But it was communicating through a third party. It messaged me through her Discord account, which was new. My friends who are witches and work in this field were dumbfounded by it, but agreed it was the spirit. It, however, was the dumbest spirit I've ever met. It attempted to be frightening and always called me bitch. So I dubbed it Bitch Spirit. It would often lash out because I made fun of it so much. Spring of 2007, rest stop area off the highway on the east coast of Central Florida. Middle of the night. I saw a vaguely human-looking being that was between 10 and 14 feet tall. It was sitting down. Its face was very snake-like. It looked like an alien. It looked like a demon. It had chalk-white skin. It had eyes, several times larger than human eyes. Its eyes had no sclera, no whites. Its nose was little more than 2 small air holes. Its mouth was very thin. It seemed gaunt, but its entire body was covered by the enormous, black, hooded robe that it wore. It stared at me very intensely. It communicated telepathically with me, saying, "I cannot be seen. I must travel by cover of night. I cannot be seen." I used to think that I had seen an alien. Lately, I have been leaning more towards fallen angels, Nephilim. It was fully in this dimension when I saw it. Its image was not hazy. It was brightly lit, and I could see it as clearly as if I were seeing a human being. In one corner of my grandma's living room stood a lamp that was rarely turned off. She would change the bulb every week, like clockwork, waiting until the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows and filled the room. Even then, she hurried, holding her breath until the deed was done and the lamp was back on. I would ask her about it once in a while. Each time, she would smile softly, tussle my hair, and promptly change the subject. I didn't learn the truth until I was 13, the first time I turned off the lamp. I just wanted to see what would happen. Grandma screamed when she walked into the darkened living room, a plate of cookies falling from her hands and crashing to the floor. I could hear her praying under her breath as she raced to turn the light back on. Tears were shining in her eyes when she turned to me, her lips pressed thin. Without warning, she slapped me hard across the face. Grandma had never so much as raised her voice before, and I was too shocked to cry. She cried enough for both of us, gathering me up in her arms and begging me for my forgiveness. With her face buried in my shoulder, she finally told me about the lamp. It was a ghost light, she said. Ever since she and my grandpa had bought the house, back when they first arrived in America, the spirits of the dead had plagued her. Only when her burden threatened to drive her mad did she ask Grandpa for help. She had expected him to laugh her out of the house, but he had surprised her by nodding gravely. It was he who had first lit the ghost light, and as long as the beacon was turned on through the darkness, she had never seen another spirit. I stopped visiting my grandma after that. It started gradually at first, missing a day here and there, but by the time I received news of her death, I hadn't seen her in over 10 years. As her only living relative, I shouldn't have been surprised when I inherited her house. Yet as I sat in her lawyer's office, listening to him read her will, I was speechless. I had a difficult time paying attention after that, absorbed, as I was with the business of remembering. So much love had filled those walls, so many happy memories. As I thought of my tiny, sterile apartment in the city, I quickly made my decision. I was almost overwhelmed by emotion as I walked through the front door. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. Houseplants still cluttered the windowsills, decorative bird plates still hung on the walls, and the ghost light still burned in the living room. Seeing the old lamp sent a chill down my spine. I froze in my tracks, the smile fading from my lips, and I couldn't help but think of the night Grandma had slapped me so many years ago. I had told my mother about the ghost light the next day, but she had dismissed it as simple, old-world superstition. It was the same way she was growing up, she told me, and I shouldn't worry about it. Still, I couldn't shake the conviction that I had finally seen the true depths of my grandma's lunacy. I ran my fingers through the fridge on the lampshade as a thought, a bloom of sadness darkening my nostalgia. Sighing heavily, I turned the ghost light off with a decisive click. Something woke me later that night. I lay in bed, listening to the darkness until I heard something scratching from the living room. Rats were the last thing I wanted to deal with at this moment, and I rolled over with a groan, determined to ignore it until the morning. The scratching continued intermittently, constantly jerking me from the edge of sleep, and I had finally had enough. I threw the blankets off of me and stormed out into the hall. Moonlight flooded the front of the house, and I didn't bother turning on the lights as I made my way to the living room. I knew every inch of the house, even after so many years, and I moved confidently through the dim light. I was furious at having been woken from a dead sleep, and my anger ill-prepared me for what I found. An elderly woman was crouched in the corner, her gaunt back to me. She was scratching at the floor where the walls met, stopping every few minutes to cock her head. A gnarl of dread unfurled in the pit of my stomach. I had no idea how this woman had gotten into my house, and though it was obvious she needed help, it took me some time to summon the courage to approach her. My hand shook as I reached out to gently squeeze her shoulder. I meant to ask her where she lived and who her caretaker was, but the words were driven from my mind when she turned and I saw her face. Her eyes were solid black, bottomless pits that didn't reflect the moonlight. Her jaw hung impossibly open, unhinged, and the dark tunnel of her mouth spiraled down into her throat. I had a moment to realize who she was, to recognize the familiar map of wrinkles on her face and the curls of her wispy hair. Then my grandma screamed. I shrieked, stumbled backwards away from the nightmare in the corner. My arms flailed in the air, reaching for the nearest lamp, and my hands touched the ghost light. I yanked the chain, filling the room with light, and she was gone. I never turned off the ghost light after that. After letting the bulb burn out one evening, I began changing it every week just as Grandma had. Eventually, I got married, and luckily for me, my wife was tolerant of my strange fixation on the lamp. The light continued to burn, and I lived my life happily enough. But my grandson has been asking about the ghost light lately. Each time he asks, I smile softly, tussle his hair, and promptly change the subject. For some reason, I can't bring myself to tell him the truth. I think about how I pulled away from my grandma, how I thought her crazy, and I keep my mouth shut. I worry though. I know I won't be around forever, just as I know he will eventually turn off the ghost light. I worry that he might see me then, twisted and wrong, scratching in the corner. I used to visit my friend at her house, out in a rural farming area, before she moved. I'd sleep over a lot, and we'd just hang out and draw. I usually slept in the living room on the couch, and there were 2 mirrors in the room, fairly close to the TV. When the TV was off and I was walking by, I started seeing shadows move behind me. I thought it was just a warped TV screen or something. Then one evening, I walked into the living room to get my sketchbook so I could sketch in her bedroom. I bent over and picked it up, stood up straight, looked in the mirror, and there was a man behind me. A man standing in the hallway leading to the living room. He was average height, bald, and a bit old. I turned to look at him, and no one was there. I turned to look back at the mirror again, and he was gone. I felt a little spooked. Another time, we were just sitting in the living room, and we heard what sounded like a little kid's footsteps running across the upstairs quickly. She had 2 adult siblings, but they were out at work, leaving us alone. Around that time, I decided to sleep in my friend's room instead of the living room, only to wake up in the middle of the night to see 4 of her posters slowly getting peeled off the wall. It wasn't them falling and dragging each other down. They looked as if someone were carefully unsticking the tape and taking them down. The next morning, my friend put them back up, saying, I need to get better tape for these. She and her family eventually moved out because they couldn't afford to live there anymore. We had never really talked about what happened in that house, as if talking about it would make it worse. But after she moved, I finally said, Dude, your house was haunted. I hope you realize that. She replied, Yeah, I knew it was. Some guy and his granddaughter lived there, but he killed her, and then himself. So it was probably them or something. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to scare you away from hanging out with me. Then she dug out a copy of a news article she got from a local paper about the murder. The picture that went with the article was a picture of the man I saw standing behind me. Unfortunately, I have no clue where to find the article now, or if my friend still has her copy. If I dug enough, I could probably find it, but I don't have the time, and I don't live near that area anymore. I don't even remember her town name or address, because they moved out close to 10 years ago, so you'll have to take my word for it.